All right, guys. So let's dive into the three biggest breakdown in regards to hip rotation mechanics. So obviously, when we're looking at hip rotation mechanics, the goal is to efficiently transfer the energy that we produced in the drive leg mechanics, right? So now it's our next step. It's our next process in regards to the mechanics of the rotation of your hips. So a lot of people, I will say just right off the bat, a lot of people, there's this misinterpretation of delaying because, and again, I completely understand like where a lot of this misinterpretation comes from, just because we talk about like torque, we talk about rotational energy, and there is a component within the delivery that we essentially delay the rotation, right? People look at like the pelvis and we see like the leaking energy, the leaking of rotational energy is to slightly kind of, over the drive phase course that this just kind of opens up. And I also do a lot of breakdowns in regards to like snapping of the pelvis. So let's just summarize this very simply. There's no point in which your hip rotation should be delayed. At least that's the way that I teach it. That's the way I coach it. That's my perspective in regards to the hip rotation mechanics, because as soon as you coach someone to delay hip rotation, you're going to have a whole lot of problems with, limiting your amount of stretch and separation that you can get. And just know that every time I say stretch, I'm referring to separation. And it's the same thing when I say launch from stretch, it's launching from your maximum amount of separation. Okay, so just so we're clear there. But back into the three biggest breakdowns, we're going to be looking at late hip rotation, right, which is, like I said, it's going to limit your amount of stretch, limit your amount of separation due to the tardiness of the timing that your hips are rotating. 2 is in elevated hips, and we talk about like the perception of power breakdown. I got things flying all over. So elevated hips, basically the posture of your hips, posture of your pelvis as soon as you sink into your drive phase. And then 3 is your trail leg and active hip flexion. Right? We want hip extension. So we're going to dive into. I've produced so much content on these because you see these breakdowns occur often. And although maybe there's some components within the hip rotation mechanics that we can talk about being a restriction of maybe stability and mobility very little, but unlike the drive leg mechanics, I personally see that it's very rarely a restriction that the individual is not accomplishing that particular move that we want him to accomplish. It's mostly motor patterns and perception of what they're trying to do, and we just want to make sure that we're nipping a lot of these bad patterns in the butt to produce as much effortless power as possible. So first we'll start with the late hip rotation, which I see as a very common breakdown, especially amongst younger individuals, because I think the older that you get, your body just does a really good job at understanding how to organize and how to move in order to produce a lot of power output. When you're younger, I think there's so much emphasis on like placing the ball where you want that you kind of just move and throw darts rather than actually increasing your power output. But either way you look at it, late hip rotation is, like I mentioned in the very beginning of this video, is when the individual perceives to increase torque and rotational energy that you need to delay. So what happens when you delay is your hips, your lower body, and your upper body are essentially moving together, right? And now as soon as you come to the point of you anchoring down, you then start to initiate, but most likely too late to initiate your rotation. So when you do anchor down, more than likely you'll see a ton of screenings that I have on this. Just type in late hip rotation. But more than likely your trunk is moving with your hips and not creating segmentation or disassociation, whatever word you want to use, whatever makes you sound a little bit smarter. So basically, the timing of the hip rotation, as we discussed already, is you want to initiate that hip rotation at some point early within your drive phase. And again, I think this depends a lot, as we'll mention, on your drive leg loading pattern. Are you quad dominant? Do you need to initiate your hip rotation earlier? Are you a hip hinge loader? Can you essentially delay a little bit because your energy is going linear? But either way, we want to initiate that rotation some point in our drive phase, and then that heel disconnection occurs via when our hip decides to rotate. Hip internal rotation dictates heel disconnection. And then so what we can do is we can then get ourselves into a position of stretch of optimal separation. And we do that by initiating our hip rotation at some point before we anchor down. As you can see why, because if we anchor down by just starting our hip rotation, then we're more likely to just have no segmentation. And when I screen guys from the back, you can see a clear distinction of this shoulder and this hip bone just moving together. And at anchor point, I want to see some segmentation, some disassociation of this shoulder and this hip bone, right? Because I do not want to see these things moving together. If you look at like that rubber band analogy that I use, you want to pull this thing, you want to create stretch, and you want to launch that rubber band from your utmost stretched potential, right? Okay, so that's the first one, late hip rotation. I will say that that's more than likely the most common. 2, elevated hips. I think this is a perception of power, meaning a lot of individuals, when they perceive what power is, they'll sink and they'll elevate, right? You think about jumping, you think about like skater jumps or anything like explosive. You hear a lot of times individuals want to, how do I get more explosive in my delivery, right? And then what you'll see is those guys are the ones that sink early and then elevate late. When we look at the delivery and we look at how to efficiently accelerate our bodies throughout the entirety of our drive phase up until the anchor point and the utilization of the slope, we want to continuously be sinking our hips, right? If you had a snapshot of like 4 different frames on the open side of our delivery from the point in which we descend from leg lift, if you can look at our hip bones, we want to see like a staircase the whole way. We don't want to see it go down and then linear and then elevate, okay? So not only does that limit our acceleration rate into our anchor point, but it's also going to, when we think about like dispersing our energy that we're creating, we don't want to elevate that energy because our target is the catcher, right? It's down. We want to sink down. We want to utilize the ground. We talk about the ground force. If our ground force production is going to be totally skewed if we're continuously elevating for a perception of power issue. And the reason why I say it's a perception of power issue 99% of the time is, as I mentioned, a lot of young kids, when they think about being powerful and explosive, a lot of the times it's jumping, right, up and down or down to up. And within the pitching delivery, there's a lot of particular movements of different planes of motions going on, but we want to think about it in terms of how can we increase our acceleration rate throughout our drive phase, how can we still continuously use the ground for energy, and how can we transfer the energy that we are producing and utilizing at the point of our anchor towards the desired target. Well, so that one is a little bit less common, but it is an issue that comes up. Now, third, probably common amongst individuals the younger age or individuals, this is where we talk about like instability issues, trail leg hip flexion, active flexion. When you see the trail leg before ball release start to shoot into flexion, you'll see that knee start to come forward. I know Dr. Heenan and I have done a lot of stuff on this. I'll include it within the eBook. But when you see that trail leg start to shoot into flexion before ball release and then after ball release, instead of maximizing hip extension, I talk a lot about hip drive and utilizing your hips to be explosive, but to be driving linear energy towards your desired task. So I like to put it really simply for individuals, honestly, because obviously we can overcomplicate it. I don't even say it's overcomplicated, but we can digest it, complicatedness, whoa, words are fun, by talking about the kinetic sequencing and the sequencing of energy coming up through the chain, and how if there's instabilities, you don't have active control of the force moving throughout your body, and how certain components of your body will showcase that, and trail leg hip flexion being extremely high on the list of things that occur within the instability portion, especially within the trunk. But if we were just to put it simply, man, if I were to sit here and I'm going to be throwing a ball that way, and I'm in a rocker stance here, and I rock back and I go to throw, and I think of actively pulling my knee forward into a throw, is that throw going to be as powerful as if I'm thinking about actively gaining ground and extending my hips into my rotation and keeping that trail leg long throughout the entire throw and after ball release? Like, Think about that. That's a really simple way to put it in terms of increasing your power output and utilizing the entire body to produce energy, right? Because if we don't, we're leaving a lot of parts that probably aren't equipped to handle as much load as we're putting on it. So hopefully that part makes sense. But those are 3 breakdowns. We'll obviously dive into the potential solutions and fixes to these issues. But those are the 3 biggest breakdowns of hip rotation mechanics. And if you're watching this from the ebook, let's keep on keeping on. And if you're watching this and have no idea what ebook I'm talking about, go get the ebook. If you're watching this on YouTube, I'm going to be giving away 5 free copies of this ebook. So be sure that you're subscribed. If you're not, you can't win. Also, leave a comment on this video and say how much you like my joggers. You don't have to do that. See you guys.